In this section of the video, we're going to learn about the totals row and aggregate functions. We'll also learn a little bit about where and some of the changes that you can make to functions or to queries. So what we want is we want a query that will calculate the number of orders that were placed during July, August, and September of 2008. So that's what we're trying to create a query for. So we can go and look at our Database Tools tab and look at our relationships and figure out, okay, well, where would we find information about orders that were placed in a certain date? Well, all of that's actually in the orders table, so we're still not moving on to multiple tables here. So here's transaction date. We know we're going to need that, and we can just count up how many orders there are and get the information from this table. So let's go and do that. We'll create a query using the designer and bring in the orders table. So here's what we'll do first. We know we want to limit by transaction date. We want a transaction date, and I'm going to zoom in here so you can see a little bit better. We want a transaction date. Let me make this a touch bigger. That is July, August, or September of 2008. So because dates are just numbers, I could use greater than or equal to and less than equal to. I'm actually just going to use between keyword. And then use our normal date notation between 7, 1, 2008, and the end of September. Now we do have to be careful and think, does September have 30 days or 31 days? And if we get it wrong, then Access is actually going to do some funny things. So we'll hit enter, and you'll see that, oh goodness, what happened here? September actually doesn't have 31 days, and so Access gets confused, it doesn't understand, it starts doing 1931 and dividing all of that date by 2008, and I don't even know what's going on here. So just be careful when you're doing dates and you're doing the end of the month, that we do things correctly. Alright, that's better. And so we can run this query and we can say, okay, well, transaction dates that were between the 1st of December and the end of September 1st of July and the end of September 2008. And we now get a list of all of those transactions. Well, at least the dates that they took place on. There's 223 transactions, and those are the dates. Some on the 1st, the 2nd of July, and so on and so forth. But what we really want is we just want that number, 223, which is helpful because, you know, I can just look right down here and we can get the record number and say, okay, well, there were 223. But what we really want is we want Access to spit out that number as just, you know, what the result of the query. So here's what we're going to do. We want the ability to have Access look down this entire column of results and count them up. Just figure out, okay, well, here's 1, here's 2, here's 3, here's 4, and just go down and count each individual one. So what we'll do is we add this totals row. We go and click on the totals row. And what that does is it adds a row down here. So I'm going to click on it. You'll see, aha, now we have the totals row. And by default, we do grouping. Grouping is what we want here. We have a number of different functions that we can use. We won't use all of them in this class. The ones we will use are sum, when we want to add things up, average, when you want to take the mean of something, the minimum, the maximum, and in this case, count. We'll also talk about where, which is not really an aggregate function, it's a different thing. We'll need it in just a minute. So what we want to do is we want to count something. But what do we want to count? Do we want to count the transaction dates? Well, we could, but that might get a little messy actually, especially because the transaction date could possibly be blank. Okay, these fields could technically be blank, and that would give us some messiness. So here's my recommendation. You can't always do this, but where possible, you try to count on a key field. So here's our key field for this table. I'm going to change this to count. And if we run this, you'll notice that, okay, well, there were 3 transactions that took place on the 1st of July, 3 that took place on the 2nd of July, down here on the 22nd of July there were 3, on the 23rd there were 4, etc. Well, that's helping me now, but I really wanted to just spit out that 223. And because there are different dates, it's not allowing that count function just to count all the way down, because there are differences on each of these records. You know, this is a different date than this row, and this is different than this row, and that's why it's not aggregating this entire column. So you would think that maybe we could just uncheck this box and run the query, and it would give us what we want, but it actually doesn't, because that criteria is still in force, and the totals row is saying to group by any unique differences and keep them separate. Well, that's not what we want. We want to change this to where. So what it does is it actually changes the underlying part of the query. But the rule of thumb is that if we're using the totals row, so we have this totals row on, and we're only adding a field for the criteria, we don't want to show it in the final query. The rule of thumb is to change it to where. And if we do that, all of a sudden we now have our 223 records, which is the number of orders that took place July, August, and September of 2008. Well, that's most of the way done. The last thing that I want to show you is when we run this, we get this funny count of order ID name of the field, which, you know, we're using the count function on this order ID field, so that, you know, that makes sense. But what if we wanted to call it, you know, quarter 3 orders? I know this is not really business quarters, but let's say calendar year quarter 3. If we wanted to call this field a different name, here's how we do that. We'll type in the name that we want to call the field, and then we'll put a colon after that. Let me expand this so you can see it. There we go. We'll put the name that we want to call the field, and then a colon, and then just leave this field name, because this one actually represents the field name that's up here in one of our tables. This, before the colon, is just the new name of the field that we're going to use. So we'll run this, and you'll notice that, there's the new name of our field, and it's 223. And we'll save this as query number 2.